So those of you that have been following along, I did a diagnostic on a Rheem gas furnace where I found that I had a bad blower motor, and I recommended doing the motor, capacitor, and wheel. So here today I'm going to be putting in a new motor, capacitor, and wheel on that Rheem gas furnace. A couple of things you should always check before doing the repair, honestly before you even leave a parts house or before you leave your office. Check to make sure that the motor isn't bound up on your new one right after the get-go. Just a quick easy test is to take it and spin it like this. If it spins freely then you're good, but if it's locked up or anything like that, also just check to make sure the box hasn't been dropped and you don't have a huge dent in your motor or anything like that. I've definitely had that happen in the past, so that's something to check. The next thing you want to check is make sure you have the right microfarad capacitor. This one takes a 15370. I'm going to check my capacitor, and right here it says it's 15370, so that looks good. Next thing is I usually do is I'll just quickly test it to make sure it's okay. Next thing I do is I'll change my meter to capacitance just to make sure everything is good on the capacitor before I even put it in. 14.8, which is within the plus or minus 6%, so we're good to go on that. And since I'm doing the blower wheel on this one as well, I just check it all for any obvious dents or dings or anything that doesn't look right. I also check to make sure this little clip is in and looks basically not loose or anything like that. That's what balances the wheel. And also I make sure I have my little set screw here. But that's everything I do before I even typically go out to the job site, just to make sure everything looks correct. So now I got the panel doors off. There's a couple of set screws I had to remove. One is going to be right here, and the other one is up on top, right up in here. I also usually undo all these plugs as much as I can. I'm also on this particular one, since it's above a T-bar ceiling, I'm going to have to undo the control wire. So I always recommend to take a picture of where everything's plugged in, or write it down just so you have it. But essentially this whole blower compartment will slide out with the control board on it, and that way I can do the repair down on the ground where it's a little bit easier and safer. And before you start anything, this little door switch here is supposed to kill power when the panel's off, but when you're getting into everything here, I highly recommend shutting the power off. Most of them have a power on-off switch right next to the indoor furnace that you're working on. If for some reason it doesn't have a switch here, you're gonna have to go back to the breaker panel and shut it off with the breaker. And then I always recommend verifying with a voltmeter that you don't have voltage before you get started, just so you don't get zapped or anything like that. So the whole blower wheel assembly slides out just like this. These little brackets, all four of them will be reused on the new motor. So you have to remove these 3 screws, and then once you get it out, these 2 screws. I usually recommend snapping a picture before this, just so you make sure everything lines up and works out the same way on the new one. Your new capacitor is going to be going in right here, so this old one should slide out, your new one should slide right in. And then on the back side here, you'll have to undo this little set screw right there so you can loosen that up. I'll then usually take like a crescent wrench and put it over this. There's a flat side so it'll catch, and then I'll just kind of twist it to kind of break it up. Sometimes they get stuck on the shaft. Another thing is I'll put a couple droplets of oil on there as well, just try to loosen it up so it slides out easier. Once you get the motor out, you'll have the wheel in here still, so you'll have to loosen up. There's these 2 screws, and then there's these ones on the other side, and this whole thing will bend back up. The wheel will slide right out. Another thing is make sure you have it set the right direction. Your little set screw needs to be on the opposite side of the motor so you can actually tighten it and get to it. So just make sure you have it going and facing the right direction when you put the new one in. So I loosened the set screw on the other side of the wheel already, and I also removed all these screws. And then I typically just take a set of cutters and just cut these wires just so everything pulls out easier, and I just disconnect the capacitor typically. I should be able to just grab from right here on both sides once I'm not holding my camera, and everything will just slide right out. I'll get the motor out. So here I just loosened the 4 set screws to get into the wheel. The wheel I can just pull out just like that, and then I always make sure I pretty much pull it out and I set it down exactly how it was in there. I can see this side doesn't have the set screw, which is the side the motor mounts onto. So I'm going to match. This side doesn't have the set screw, and all the vanes are also pointing in the same direction. So now I'm just going to drop the new one right in. I already did my inspection on the wheel, so I know we're good there. Now I'm just going to add my 4 screws. This will push back down. I'm just going to add my 4 screws into this and get ready to mount the new motor back in. So here's my old motor. I'm going to remove all these mounting brackets and screw them on to the new motor. You can see there is the little holes for the new. Everything should line up. If it doesn't, I'd definitely call up your parts house and verify you have the correct motor. Other than that though, that's my next step here, is I'm going to put those mounting brackets on the new motor. So I got the new brackets onto the new motor. I just dropped it right into the hole on the wheel with the shaft of the motor. I usually always try to make sure that these wires align and are on the same side as the control board and all my controls. Sometimes some of these motors don't give you enough slack, and you literally have to pull everything back apart, rotate the motor so it's pointing in the right direction. Another thing I will sometimes do is take a Sharpie and just mark the side that has the wires. This one's a little bit easier because the board's still attached to the whole blower assembly, but that's not always the case. Another thing is this new motor has a ground, so I'll just probably add it right in here when I screw in the brackets. That is everything up to this point. The new capacitor goes in pretty easily. You just have to remove this screw right here. This whole one will slide out, and then you just slide the new one in, put the screw back. That's pretty much as easy as it gets as far as putting in the capacitor. So I'll usually put the blower housing on its side. That way I can get to the set screw here easier. As you can see, when I spin it, you can hear the grinding, so you got to make sure that you push this back to where it's centered as best you can. I try to get it as centered as best I can inside the blower housing. And then when you actually push down this set screw, you can kind of see that there's a flat side on this shaft. You just want to make sure this flat side lines up with your set screw. You want to tighten this down, make sure you get it nice and tight. Definitely don't forget this step. Otherwise you'll have to be pulling everything apart to get to it. Once I get everything secured and tight, I'll typically do a nice free spin with it with my hand. If everything sounds good, then I get ready to mount it back inside the furnace. On this particular application, since I have everything out with the board, I try to do as much as I can in an easier space to work. And since this one's above the T-bar, I'm going to try to do all of it down here as much as I can. But all the wiring, since this is an OEM motor, I can pretty much just match up the color wire with everything I remove over here that I cut earlier. The reason why I cut it is now it's just a lot easier hooking up all the wires. I can just go wire for wire. As far as the capacitor, I just hooked up the brown wires again going to it, and then when I'm all done, I will either zip tie so everything's nice and tight, or I will take, just to get out of the way, I've had where wires or something like that, I've gone to service calls where wires have gotten sucked into the blower compartment, into the wheel, and just wreak havoc on the unit. So definitely make sure you have all your wires zip tied or taped or something. This will be the next step, and then after this I can put it up back in the unit. Something to add, if you're not using an OEM motor, what you're going to have to do is make sure all the colors you're using match up with the old motor, as far as fan speed. So if you're using high fan speed on one motor, you need to make sure you're using the same color wire for the new motor. A good way to do that is to just look on the actual motor. It's stamped all the different speeds. You can see right here all the different speeds are saying, you know, yellow is medium low, red's low, stuff like that. You just need to make sure you're matching your wires and your speeds correctly. So whenever you have the blower motor out, I always recommend just checking the heat exchanger. This is a high efficient one, so this is the secondary heat exchanger. This is just a good way, good visual inspection you can do on the heat exchanger. That way you can just make sure you don't have any cracks or anything like that. So as you can see, before you put the new blower motor housing back in, you can see there's a track on the bottom here and up here. You just want to make sure everything slides back in. Everything should line up so where you can get the screws back into the screw holes that holds the whole blower motor housing in. So just make sure you're in that track. It's sometimes can be a little bit difficult to do, but just make sure you're in that track, otherwise you're going to create a lot of issues. So I got everything put back in, got my set screws back in down here and up here, capacitors in, got all my thermostat wire and controls hooked back up, all these plugs I plugged back in. I have this little tool here that goes over the door switch just to hold the door switch in, so when I turn this back on I can kind of watch everything and test it. Have my power off. I'm going to turn that back on and we'll see. Right away the motor kicked right back on, so everything looks good to go. I'll take some amp draw readings just to make sure everything looks good. I'll test it in heat mode here since it's winter time, just to make sure everything looks good. That's how you change out a blower motor on a Rheem furnace. These are all OEM parts. Any questions, put them down in the comments, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.